Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible stupidity of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who somehow managed to survive summers so hot that modern meteorologists would declare a state of emergency and hide in air-conditioned bunkers. From rubbing animal dung on their necks to sleeping with farm animals, their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and questionable life choices. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy learning about people who thought cow breath was air conditioning. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 872, and the good news is you're still alive. The bad news, you're about to discover that medieval summer survival made modern camping look like a luxury spa vacation. Picture this. You're living in what historians politely call a dwelling, but what you'd probably call a wooden oven with a door. The walls are so thin you could probably sneeze through them. There's no insulation unless you count the charming layer of mud and animal dung smeared between the sticks, and your only window is a hole stuffed with a piece of cowhide that's seen better centuries. The temperature inside your home, well, let's just say if it was 90 degrees outside, it was a toasty 88 degrees inside. Medieval climate control at its finest. But it gets better. Your bed is a sack stuffed with straw that's probably older than your grandfather. Your blanket is a piece of wool that smells suspiciously like the sheep it came from last winter. And your pillow is, well, you don't have a pillow. Pillows were for rich people and people who hadn't given up on life yet. The medieval peasant approach to extreme heat was basically this. If you can't beat it, join it. And if you can't join it, find increasingly creative ways to not die. And trust me, creativity was their middle name, right after probably going to die of something preventable. Your typical medieval peasant faced summer heat with all the resources of a modern survivalist, minus the survival training, the equipment, the knowledge, and the options. What they had instead was stubbornness, animal waste, and a shocking willingness to try absolutely anything if it meant not becoming a medieval jerky. So there you are, sweating in your stick-and-mud mansion, wearing clothes that haven't been washed since the last time it rained hard enough to stand naked in, wondering how exactly your ancestors managed to survive long enough to create you. The answer? They got weird with it, really, really weird. Now you might think the solution to deadly heat would be to get the smelly, heat-generating animals out of your house. You would be wrong. Medieval peasants had discovered something that modern science wouldn't understand for another 1,000 years. Animals are basically living, breathing, slobbering air conditioners.
Yes, you read that correctly. The same animals you've been trying to keep out of your living room? Medieval peasants invited them in for sleepovers. Here's how it worked, and prepare to have your mind blown by medieval genius. Animals breathe out moisture constantly. Moisture in dry air creates evaporative cooling. Evaporative cooling drops the temperature. It's the same principle that powers modern swamp coolers, except instead of a machine, you had Bessie the cow standing in your kitchen chewing cud and looking judgmental. Your mother, a practical woman who'd survived 40 summers through pure spite and cow breath, would explain this to you like she was teaching you the most obvious thing in the world. Animals are cooling machines, dear. That's why God made them sweat and breathe and smell terrible. It's all part of his plan to keep us from dying of heat. The cow got prime real estate, the southwest corner, where the morning sun would normally turn your house into a pottery kiln. Her massive body blocked the solar radiation, while her steady breathing created a microclimate that was somehow bearable. The pigs, being naturally drawn to the coolest spots like furry little temperature sensors, claimed the area near the stone foundation where the Earth's cooling properties were strongest. And the chickens, well, chickens are basically tiny, feathered humidity machines. Their rapid breathing created small zones of increased moisture that made the air feel less like breathing in a forge.
But here's where it gets really good. Your medieval ancestors didn't just stumble onto this by accident. They actually observed that animals sought out the coolest places and then thought, you know what? If it's good enough for the pig, it's good enough for me. So there you'd be, sitting next to a cow, breathing air that had recently been inside, said cow, thinking this is fine, this is luxury, at least I'm not dead. The best part? Modern scientists studying traditional cooling methods have discovered that medieval peasants accidentally created some of the most efficient, natural air conditioning systems ever devised. They just did it with livestock and stubbornness instead of technology. Of course, there were downsides, mainly the fact that you were sharing your bedroom with animals who had very different ideas about personal hygiene than you did. But when the alternative was death by overheating, you learned to appreciate cow breath as the gift it truly was. But wait, there's more, because medieval peasants weren't content with just animal air conditioning. Oh no, they had to go and get fancy with it.
Enter the most surprisingly sophisticated piece of technology you've never heard of: wet reed mats. And before you roll your eyes and think, oh great, medieval people hanging up wet grass, let me blow your mind with some ancient Persian engineering that would make modern HVAC technicians weep with envy.
Your mother learned this trick from a traveling Persian merchant who probably thought Europeans were adorably primitive with their just suffer through the heat approach to summer. This merchant, with the patience of someone explaining fire to cavemen, showed her how to weave fresh reeds into flat mats and hang them across doorways and window openings. Now watch, she'd say, dampening the mats with precious water from the well. This is how you steal coolness from the air itself. What happened next was basically magic, if magic involved understanding thermodynamics 1,000 years before anyone knew what thermodynamics was. As the hot, dry air passed through the wet reeds, something beautiful occurred. The water evaporated, absorbing heat energy in the process and cooling the remaining air. It was the same principle used in modern evaporative coolers, but medieval people figured it out by observing nature and thinking, what if we made the wind wet? The result? Air entering your house became noticeably, dramatically cooler. We're talking about temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees, which in medieval terms was the difference between uncomfortably warm and actively dying of heat. Persian engineers had been perfecting this technique for centuries, using it to cool entire palace complexes in the desert. They understood that if you could control how air moved through water-soaked materials, you could create artificial coolness anywhere. It was environmental engineering disguised as crafts time. But here's the really impressive part. The reeds weren't just randomly hung up. Your mother positioned them strategically to catch prevailing winds, create cross breezes, and maximize the cooling effect. She understood airflow patterns, evaporation rates, and thermal dynamics without ever taking a physics class. The Persian merchant had also taught her about maintenance: refresh the water regularly, replace moldy reeds, adjust positioning based on wind direction. It was a complete cooling system that required attention and skill to operate effectively. Modern architects studying traditional Middle Eastern cooling methods have discovered that these reed mat systems were incredibly sophisticated. They could cool spaces by 20+ degrees using nothing but plant matter, water, and an understanding of how air behaves when it encounters moisture. Standing in your surprisingly comfortable medieval house, surrounded by the gentle sounds of breathing animals and the whisper of cool air flowing through your Persian reed air conditioning system, you'd realize something profound. The people you'd always thought of as primitive were actually environmental engineering geniuses who solved problems using observation, creativity, and a willingness to try things that seemed completely insane. Just when you thought medieval cooling technology couldn't get any more impressive, your neighbor Agnes beckons you toward what appears to be absolutely nothing. Just a grassy mound behind her house that looks like someone gave up halfway through building a hill. Come, she says with the excitement of someone about to show you the medieval equivalent of a Tesla, let me show you something that will change your life. She opens what looks like a completely normal wooden door set into the side of what you now realize isn't a natural hill at all.
The moment she lifts that door, you're hit with air, so cool it actually raises goosebumps on your overheated skin. In the middle of a heat wave that's killing crops and making animals faint, you've just discovered a medieval refrigerator.
Welcome to the underground chamber, where medieval peasants had accidentally discovered geothermal cooling principles that modern green architects are just now beginning to understand. Agnes leads you down stone steps into what can only be described as nature's own air conditioning system. The temperature here is a constant 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what hellish heat is happening on the surface. It's like stepping into early spring in the middle of summer. The earth keeps its own weather, Agnes explains, running her hand along the stone walls that seem to radiate coolness. Always the same temperature, winter or summer. We're not fighting the heat up there. We're escaping into the earth's embrace. Looking around, you realize this isn't just a hole in the ground. This is sophisticated underground architecture. The chamber is carefully constructed with fitted stones, proper drainage, and ventilation shafts that create air circulation. Someone understood engineering principles that wouldn't be formally recognized for centuries. But here's the really mind-blowing part. Agnes reveals that nearly half the village has similar underground chambers. What you initially thought were just random root cellars are actually a network of cooling spaces based on understanding the Earth's thermal properties. These underground sanctuaries weren't afterthoughts. They were planned features. Families would spend the hottest parts of the day down here, emerging only when the surface temperature became bearable. Children played in underground coolness while their parents worked briefly above ground during the cooler morning hours. The chambers served multiple purposes: food storage, better than any medieval pantry, emergency shelter during heat waves, and social gathering spaces. Agnes shows you alcoves for different activities, food preparation areas, sleeping spaces for the sick or elderly, even small workshops where crafts could continue during the dangerous heat. Modern scientists studying these underground cooling systems have discovered that medieval people had accidentally created some of the most energy-efficient climate control ever devised. By using the Earth's natural thermal mass, they achieved year-round temperature stability that modern green buildings spend millions trying to replicate. The really impressive part? These chambers were often connected by tunnels, creating underground networks that allowed people to move between houses without exposing themselves to deadly surface heat. Entire communities could function underground during heat waves, emerging only when it was safe. Standing in Agnes's underground marvel, cooled by the earth itself and surrounded by the gentle circulation of air through natural ventilation systems, you realize you're witnessing something extraordinary. Medieval people hadn't just survived extreme heat, they'd created parallel underground civilizations designed for comfort and survival. As you prepare to return to the surface, Agnes shares one final piece of information that completely changes your understanding of medieval technology. This is nothing compared to what they're doing in the monastery. Brother Marcus learned techniques in the Holy Land that can actually make ice during summer heat. Ice, using nothing but sun and wind and water. Your mind reels. Ice? During heat that's melting everything else, it seems impossible, magical, the stuff of fairy tales. But after experiencing animal air conditioning, Persian reed technology, and underground cooling chambers, you're beginning to understand that medieval impossibilities have a way of turning out to be ingenious engineering solutions disguised as everyday life. Tomorrow, you'll discover that making ice in summer heat isn't magic at all. It's just another day at medieval engineering school. So you thought medieval peasants were clever with their cow breath air conditioning? Well, buckle up, because we're about to meet the people who looked at the Sahara Desert and said, "You know what this place needs? A nice villa with central cooling." Welcome to Roman North Africa, circa 200 AD, where the empire's greatest minds decided that conquering half the known world wasn't enough. They also needed to make the desert comfortable for people who were used to Mediterranean breezes and wine that didn't instantly turn to vinegar in the heat. Picture this. You're a Roman engineer, fresh from building perfectly functional heating systems back in chilly Britain. and some general hands you a map of modern-day Tunisia and says, make this livable for 50,000 soldiers, their families, and enough administrators to run a small country. Oh, and the temperature regularly hits 120 degrees in the shade. Have fun. Your first thought, I should have listened to my mother and become a philosopher. Your second thought, well, if we can heat buildings in freezing climates, surely we can cool them in hellish ones. How hard could it be? The answer? Surprisingly not that hard if you were willing to completely reimagine everything you thought you knew about air, water, and the basic principles of not dying of heat stroke. Roman engineers approached desert cooling the same way they approached everything else, with massive infrastructure projects, slave labor, and an absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible. If nature said, this place is uninhabitable, Romans said, hold my wine and watch this. The first brilliant insight came from a grumpy engineer named Marcus Refrigerius. Okay, I made up that name, but Roman names were ridiculous anyway. Who was staring at a traditional hypocaust heating system and thinking, what if we just ran this backwards? See, Romans had already figured out how to move hot air through walls to warm buildings. The hypocaust system used furnaces to heat air, which then travelled through hollow spaces in walls and floors, keeping entire buildings toasty during cold northern winters. Marcus, let's stick with him, realized that if you could move hot air, you could also move cold air. And if you could move cold air from cool places to hot places, you could essentially steal coolness from underground and distribute it throughout a building. It was brilliant, it was simple, it was the kind of obvious solution that's only obvious after someone actually thinks of it. But here's where Romans really showed off. They didn't just reverse their heating systems. Oh no, that would be too easy. They created something entirely new, underground cooling chambers that could manufacture cold air in the middle of the desert. The basic principle was this: dig deep enough underground where the earth maintains a constant cool temperature year-round. Build chambers down there with water features, air circulation, and cooling surfaces. Then use the same engineering that heated buildings to pull that manufactured cool air up and distribute it throughout your desert villa. The result? Romans living in North African desert cities with indoor temperatures that were more comfortable than most modern homes without air conditioning. And the best part? While everyone else was suffering and dying in the heat, Romans were literally chilling in their underground cooling systems, probably drinking chilled wine and complaining that the cooling wasn't quite even throughout all the rooms. Because if there's one thing Romans loved more than conquering impossible places, it was making those places comfortable enough to complain about minor inconveniences. Now, if you think Roman engineers stopped at underground cooling chambers, you clearly don't understand the Roman approach to problem solving, which was basically, if some is good, more is better, and way too much is just getting started. Enter the most over-engineered cooling system in human history: the aqueduct refrigerator network. Romans looked at their famous aqueduct system, you know, those massive stone structures that carried water across hundreds of miles, and thought, this is nice, but what if we also used it to air condition the entire empire? Your typical Roman aqueduct was already an engineering marvel that made modern water systems look like garden hoses. But in the desert territories, Roman engineers realized they could turn these water highways into the backbone of a civilization-wide cooling network. Here's how it worked, and prepare to have your mind blown by Roman audacity. First, they identified the coldest water sources they could find: mountain springs, deep wells, underground rivers that had never seen sunlight. Then they engineered aqueducts not just to transport this water, but to keep it as cold as possible during transport. The aqueducts themselves became massive cooling machines. By running the water through underground sections, covering channels with stone to block sunlight, and creating strategic cascades that used evaporation to drop water temperature even further, Romans could deliver legitimately cold water to desert cities hundreds of miles away. But here's where it gets really impressive. They didn't just use this cold water for drinking. They used it for environmental control. Roman desert villas featured water walls, essentially hollow walls with cold aqueduct water constantly flowing through them. The walls themselves became giant cooling surfaces that dropped room temperature by 20 to 30 degrees. It was radiant cooling technology that wouldn't be invented again until modern green architecture. The really fancy houses had water floors, hollow floor systems where cold water flowed underneath living spaces, creating cool surfaces that made walking around barefoot feel like stepping on natural air conditioning. And for the truly wealthy, water ceilings. Hollow ceiling systems where cold water flowing overhead created cool air that naturally sank down into rooms. It was gravitational air conditioning powered by Roman engineering and mountain water. But wait, there's more, Romans loved. But wait, there's more moments. The system was designed for cascading cooling. Cold water from the mountains would first flow through the most important buildings, the governor's palace, military headquarters, temples. As it flowed through these cooling systems, the water would warm up slightly, but it was still cooler than ambient desert temperature. So this warmed water would then flow to secondary buildings, officer quarters, administrative buildings, wealthy merchant houses. After cooling these buildings, the water would flow to public baths, markets, and residential areas. By the time the water reached the end of the system, it had been used to cool an entire city, while still being perfectly good for drinking, cooking, and agriculture. The Romans had created a multi-stage cooling network that could air condition an entire desert civilization using nothing but water, stone engineering, and an absolute refusal to accept that deserts had to be hot. Modern engineers studying Roman desert cities have found evidence of cooling systems so sophisticated that they rivals current technology. Some Roman desert houses maintained indoor temperatures 40 degrees cooler than outside temperature, using only passive cooling and water flow. The really mind-blowing part? The entire system was self-maintaining. As long as water flowed from the mountains, the cooling network operated automatically. No energy input, no maintenance crews, no complex machinery, just Roman engineering and the laws of physics working together to make the impossible routine. Standing in the ruins of a Roman desert villa, you can still feel the cool air rising from ancient water channels carved into stone floors. 1,500 years later, Roman air conditioning is still trying to work. Now, you might think that Roman cooling technology was reserved for wealthy villa owners and government buildings. You'd be wrong. Romans were so obsessed with climate control that they even air-conditioned their gladiator fights. Yes, you read that correctly. The same people who threw criminals to lions also made sure everyone stayed comfortable while watching the carnage. Welcome to the Colosseum's cooling system, where Roman engineers looked at 50,000 people sitting in the desert sun, watching people fight to the death and thought, you know what this needs? Climate control. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena, it was a massive air conditioning system disguised as an entertainment venue. And the technology behind it was so advanced that modern stadium designers are still trying to figure out how Romans did it without electricity. First, there was the velarium, a massive retractable awning system operated by hundreds of sailors who had apparently been reassigned from fighting sea battles to providing shade for blood sport enthusiasts. This wasn't just a big tent, it was an engineered cooling system that created controlled airflow across the entire seating area. But the real genius was underground. Beneath the arena floor was a vast network of chambers, tunnels, and air shafts called the hypogeum. While everyone thinks this was just for storing gladiators and wild animals, it was actually a sophisticated climate control system that could manipulate air temperature and flow throughout the entire stadium. Here's how it worked. Cool air was drawn in through underground tunnels connected to the city's aqueduct system. This air was then channeled through the hypogeum's chambers, where it was further cooled by contact with cold stone surfaces and water features. Strategic openings in the arena floor allowed this cool air to rise into the seating areas, creating a constant flow of refreshing air for spectators. The system was so effective that gladiator fights could continue even during the hottest desert days, with 50,000 spectators sitting comfortably in what should have been unbearable heat. But here's where Roman engineering gets really impressive. They didn't just cool the spectators, they climate-controlled the gladiators too. Gladiator-holding areas featured their own cooling systems, underground chambers with cold water flowing through walls and floors. Before fights, gladiators could cool down in what were essentially ancient locker rooms with air conditioning. The idea was that well-cooled gladiators would fight better and longer, providing more entertainment value. Even the animal-holding areas were climate-controlled. Romans realized that lions and tigers fought more aggressively when they weren't suffering from heat exhaustion, so they built cooling systems for the beasts too. Only Romans would engineer air conditioning for animals they were about to unleash on people. The technology extended beyond the Colosseum. Roman amphitheaters across North Africa featured similar cooling systems adapted to local climates. In some desert arenas, underground chambers were connected to Carnot-style cooling tunnels that drew cold air from miles away. Modern archaeologists studying Roman amphitheaters have found evidence of cooling systems so sophisticated they rivals current stadium technology. Airflow calculations, thermal dynamics, even humidity control. Romans had figured out everything necessary to keep large crowds comfortable in extreme heat. The really mind-blowing discovery? Some Roman arenas could actually create localized weather effects. By controlling airflow and humidity, they could generate cooling breezes, light mists, even temperature variations between different seating sections. VIP seating wasn't just about better views, it was about premium climate control. Standing in the ruins of a Roman amphitheater in North Africa, you can still see the air shafts, cooling channels, and circulation systems that once kept thousands of people comfortable while watching the ancient world's most popular entertainment. Romans didn't just conquer the desert. They made it comfortable enough to enjoy recreational violence in air-conditioned luxury. Only an empire that built roads across continents would think to install climate control in buildings designed for watching people fight wild animals. But if you think Roman cooling technology peaked with air-conditioned gladiator fights, you're about to meet the most over-engineered military unit in history, the Desert Legion Cooling Corps, also known as the guys who made sure Roman soldiers didn't melt while conquering Africa. Roman military engineers looked at the problem of marching legions across the Sahara and came to a practical conclusion. We could train soldiers to be tougher, or we could just bring our own climate with us. Let's go with option 2. The result was the most elaborate portable cooling system ever devised by ancient technology. Roman desert legions didn't just carry weapons and supplies, they carried an entire infrastructure for manufacturing cool air in the middle of nowhere. The basic unit was called a refrigerium mobile. I may be making up Latin terms, but Roman military naming was wonderfully ridiculous. It was essentially a portable cooling station that could be assembled by a squad of soldiers in about an hour. Here's how it worked. Soldiers would dig a shallow pit and line it with specially treated leather that had been soaked in a cooling compound made from saltpeter, certain plant oils, and other ingredients that Roman military engineers had discovered through trial, error, and probably a lot of heat stroke. Water, carried in special double-walled containers that kept it cool during transport, was poured into this lined pit. Cloth screens treated with the same cooling compounds were stretched above the pit on portable frames. As desert wind passed through these treated screens and over the cool water, it created a microclimate that could drop temperatures by 15 to 20 degrees in a space large enough for a dozen soldiers. But Romans didn't stop there. Oh, well, no, that would be far too simple for an empire that built heated floors in Britain. The advanced version included portable wind catchers, collapsible structures that could capture and direct desert breezes through the cooling system. These looked like fabric sails, but functioned like primitive air scoops, gathering air from higher elevations where it was cooler and channeling it through the cooling chambers. For longer campaigns, Roman engineers would establish cooling depots, semi-permanent installations that could provide climate relief for entire legions. These featured underground chambers dug deep enough to reach cooler earth, water storage systems that kept supplies cold for weeks, and air circulation networks that could cool large areas. The really impressive part was the logistics. Roman supply lines included specialized cooling equipment trained cooling technicians, yes, that was apparently a military specialty, and even ice transport from mountain regions when available. Some Roman desert campaigns included ice cavalry, fast riders whose only job was to transport ice from mountainous regions to desert legions, carrying it in special insulated containers that could preserve ice for days in extreme heat. The military manuals from this period, because Romans wrote manuals for everything, include detailed instructions for desert cooling operations, how to identify the best locations for cooling depots, how to calculate water requirements for cooling large groups, how to repair cooling equipment using materials available in the desert. Modern military engineers studying these Roman cooling systems have found techniques so effective that some are still used by special forces operating in extreme climates. The principle of creating localized cool microclimates using portable equipment and natural resources remains sound. But here's the most Roman part of the whole system. It wasn't just functional, it was hierarchical. Officers got better cooling systems than regular soldiers. Generals had portable cooling chambers that could maintain near comfortable temperatures, and the truly elite had cooling slaves whose only job was to operate personal climate control systems. Because if there's one thing Romans loved more than engineering solutions to impossible problems, it was making sure the engineering solutions reflected proper social hierarchy. The legacy of Roman desert cooling technology extended far beyond military campaigns. Many of the techniques developed for legion cooling were adapted for civilian use, spreading Roman climate control technology throughout the empire's desert territories. Today, archaeologists working in former Roman desert regions still find evidence of these cooling systems: underground chambers, air circulation tunnels, water cooling networks, and the remains of portable cooling equipment that allowed Romans to bring Mediterranean comfort to the middle of the Sahara. We'll discover how Egyptian pyramid builders stayed cool while moving 2-ton blocks under the blazing desert sun. Spoiler alert, it involved more than just drinking a lot of water. So you thought Romans were impressive with their desert air conditioning? Well, meet the people who looked at the Egyptian desert, a place so hot it makes the Sahara look like a pleasant spring day, and said, "You know what this place needs? Some massive stone pyramids, and we're going to build them using nothing but human labor, rope, and sheer bloody-minded determination." Welcome to Giza, circa 2580 BC, where the average summer temperature hits 120 degrees in the shade. Except there is no shade, because you're building monuments that won't cast any useful shadows for another 10 years. Picture this. You're a pyramid worker, which is ancient Egyptian for person who has made questionable life choices. Your job is to move 2.5-ton limestone blocks up a ramp in temperatures that would make modern construction workers call their union representatives and go on strike. Your tools? A copper chisel, some rope, and the ancient Egyptian equivalent of "suck it up, buttercup."
Your safety equipment, the god's good favor, and whatever amulet your mother gave you.
Your air conditioning? Well, that's where things get interesting. Because here's the thing about ancient Egyptians. They didn't just survive building the pyramids in impossible heat. They thrived. They created the most sophisticated worker cooling systems in the ancient world. Systems so effective that pyramid construction continued year-round in conditions that should have killed everyone involved. The first clue that Egyptians had figured something out comes from the worker villages near the pyramids. Archaeological evidence shows these weren't just random collections of huts where people slept between shifts of dying of heat stroke. These were planned communities with sophisticated cooling infrastructure that kept thousands of workers alive and productive in lethal conditions. Egyptian engineers had observed something that wouldn't be scientifically understood for millennia. The desert gets cold. Not during the day, obviously. During the day, it's trying to kill you. But at night, desert temperatures can drop 40 to 50 degrees. The same thermal mass that stores heat during the day releases it at night, creating natural cooling opportunities. The question was, how do you capture nighttime coolness and save it for daytime use? The answer involved digging. Lots and lots of digging. Egyptian workers created underground cooling chambers that made Roman hypocausts look like amateur hour. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were engineered thermal storage systems that could capture cool night air and preserve it for daytime use. The basic principle was brilliant in its simplicity. Cold air is heavier than hot air. If you create the right kind of underground space, you can trap cold air like water in a well, then draw it up when you need it. But here's where Egyptians really showed off their engineering prowess. They didn't just store cold air, they manufactured it. Egyptian cooling chambers featured evaporation walls, surfaces designed to maximize water evaporation and heat absorption. During the hot day, these walls would absorb massive amounts of heat energy. At night, when temperatures dropped, they would release this stored heat into the cool air, creating powerful air currents that could be channeled and controlled. The result? Underground chambers that maintained temperatures 30 to 40 degrees cooler than surface conditions, even during the hottest part of the day. And these weren't small spaces. Archaeological evidence shows cooling chambers large enough to accommodate hundreds of workers at a time, with air circulation systems that could provide relief for entire work gangs during the most dangerous heat periods. The really impressive part? The cooling chambers were strategically located around pyramid construction sites, so that workers were never more than a few minutes away from life-saving temperature relief. Egyptian project managers had calculated optimal work-to-cooling ratios that maximized productivity while minimizing death by heat stroke. Modern construction companies working in extreme heat environments have studied Egyptian worker cooling systems and found techniques so effective that some are still used today. The principle of creating cool refuges near work sites, scheduling work around thermal cycles, and using natural cooling methods remains sound engineering practice. Standing at Giza today, looking at monuments that required moving 2.3 million stone blocks in temperatures that would disable modern machinery, you realize something profound. The people who built these weren't just tough, they were environmental engineering geniuses who solved problems that would challenge modern technology. But the underground cooling chambers were just the beginning of Egyptian heat survival mastery. Now, if you think Egyptian cooling technology stopped at worker relief stations, you clearly don't understand pharaonic priorities. When you're a god king who's building your own eternal resting place, comfortable working conditions for the peasants is nice, but air-conditioned luxury for the divine ruler is essential. Meet the most over-engineered royal cooling system in ancient history. The pharaoh's ice chambers. Yes, you read that correctly. Ice chambers. In Egypt. In 2500 BC, Egyptian royal engineers looked at the problem of keeping the pharaoh comfortable during pyramid construction and came to a practical conclusion. If we're going to build something that lasts forever, we might as well make sure the person paying for it doesn't melt while supervising. The solution involved a technology so advanced that European engineers wouldn't figure it out for another 4,000 years. Artificial ice production using nothing but solar energy and basic chemistry. Here's how it worked, and prepare to have your mind blown by ancient Egyptian ingenuity. Egyptian chemists had discovered that certain combinations of saltpeter potassium nitrate, salt, and plant-based compounds could create endothermic reactions, chemical processes that absorbed heat energy and created freezing temperatures even in desert heat. Using this knowledge, royal engineers built ice houses, specially designed chambers where these chemical cooling reactions could be controlled and sustained. Water poured into these chambers would actually freeze, creating real ice in the middle of the Egyptian desert. But here's where it gets really impressive. They didn't just make ice, they created an entire cold storage and distribution system. The ice was wrapped in specially treated linen. Yes, mummies weren't the only things getting the deluxe wrap treatment, and stored in underground chambers lined with insulating materials. These ice storage facilities could preserve frozen water for weeks in desert heat. Royal barges on the Nile featured portable ice chambers, essentially ancient Egyptian refrigerated transport. The pharaoh could travel from Memphis to Giza while enjoying chilled drinks and cooled air that would have been impossible for anyone else in the ancient world. The royal worksite featured cooling pavilions, temporary structures where the pharaoh could observe construction while being surrounded by ice-cooled air. These pavilions were essentially mobile air conditioning units powered by chemical cooling and operated by specially trained cooling attendants. And for the truly important occasions, the pharaoh had access to ice rooms, chambers where the walls, floors, and even furniture were cooled using ice and chemical cooling systems. Imagine hosting a meeting about pyramid construction while sitting in a room that's 60 degrees cooler than the desert outside. The technology wasn't just about comfort, it was about power. Being able to create ice in the desert was such an impressive demonstration of control over nature that it became part of royal propaganda. Foreign dignitaries would be invited to witness the pharaoh casually enjoying ice-cold drinks while standing in the middle of the world's hottest desert. Egyptian records, because Egyptians recorded everything, include detailed instructions for operating royal cooling systems, recipes for chemical cooling compounds, maintenance schedules for ice storage chambers, even staff assignments for cooling operations. There were apparently full-time royal ice technicians whose only job was maintaining the pharaoh's personal climate control. Modern chemists studying ancient Egyptian cooling compounds have discovered techniques so sophisticated that some are still used in specialized applications today. The principle of using chemical reactions to create cooling effects without external energy sources remains a key component of modern cooling technology. But here's the most Egyptian part of the whole system. It wasn't just functional, it was symbolic. The ability to create winter in the middle of summer was seen as evidence of the pharaoh's divine power over the natural world. Ice wasn't just cooling technology, it was proof of godhood. The legacy of Egyptian royal cooling extended far beyond individual pharaohs. The technology developed for royal comfort was gradually adapted for noble use, then wealthy merchant use, eventually spreading throughout Egyptian society. Archaeological evidence shows that many wealthy Egyptian homes featured smaller versions of royal cooling systems, ice storage chambers, chemical cooling devices, even primitive air conditioning powered by solar energy and advanced chemistry. Today, working in the ruins of royal cooling chambers near the pyramids, archaeologists still find evidence of the chemical compounds, insulation materials, and engineering systems that allowed pharaohs to enjoy Arctic comfort while building monuments in one of the hottest places on Earth. But if you think royal ice chambers were the peak of Egyptian cooling mastery, wait until you hear about the Nile-powered air conditioning network. Egyptian engineers looked at the Nile River, a massive water source flowing right past their construction sites, and had what can only be described as the ancient world's greatest eureka moment. What if we turned the entire river into a giant air conditioning system? The result was the most ambitious cooling infrastructure project in human history, a civilization-wide air conditioning network powered by river water, natural physics, and Egyptian engineering audacity. Here's the basic concept, which sounds simple until you realize the scale. Cold water flowing underground can cool air, which can then be distributed through buildings and work sites. Multiply this by the entire length of the Nile, connect it to every major construction project in Egypt, and you've got climate control for an entire civilization. Egyptian engineers began by observing that Nile water, especially from deeper sections and underground sources, remained relatively cool even during the hottest desert months. The river acted as a massive thermal sink, absorbing and dissipating heat energy from the surrounding environment. The question was, how do you extract this cooling power and distribute it where it's needed? The answer involved digging canals, not just any canals, underground cooling canals that could transport cold water while maintaining its temperature and using it for environmental control. These weren't simple irrigation ditches. Egyptian cooling canals were sophisticated engineering systems with multiple levels, controlled flow rates, and air circulation features that turned flowing water into flowing cool air. The basic design worked like this. Underground canals carried cold Nile water beneath buildings and work sites. As air moved over this flowing cold water, it cooled dramatically. Vertical shafts and horizontal channels distributed this cooled air throughout structures, creating natural air conditioning powered by river flow. But Egyptians didn't stop there. They created cooling cascades, multi-level water features that maximized cooling through controlled evaporation. As water flowed down these stepped channels, it absorbed heat energy through evaporation, creating progressively cooler air at each level. The system was designed for scalability. Major construction sites like the pyramid complexes featured primary cooling canals fed directly from the Nile. Secondary canals branched off to serve different work areas. Tertiary channels provided cooling to individual buildings and storage areas. For the really important projects, Egyptian engineers created cooling networks, interconnected systems that could provide air conditioning for entire settlements. Worker villages near the pyramids featured underground canal systems that could cool thousands of people simultaneously. The technology included flow control, stone gates and channels that could regulate water flow and cooling intensity based on temperature, work schedules, and seasonal conditions. Egyptian cooling engineers could literally dial up or down the air conditioning for different areas based on need. Modern hydrologists studying these ancient cooling canals have discovered engineering principles so advanced they're still used in modern cooling systems. The Egyptians had figured out optimal flow rates, channel depths, and air circulation patterns that maximized cooling efficiency. But here's where Egyptian engineering gets really impressive. They integrated the cooling network with their construction logistics. The same underground channels that provided cooling also transported materials, moved workers, and even carried communication between different work sites. Pyramid construction became a climate-controlled operation. Workers could move between different areas while staying in cooled environments. Materials could be stored in temperature-controlled conditions. Even the massive stone blocks were kept cool during transport, preventing thermal expansion that could affect construction precision. The cooling network wasn't just functional, it was strategic. During the hottest parts of the day, when surface work became impossible, entire construction crews could retreat to underground cooled areas and continue working on tasks like tool maintenance, material preparation, and planning. Egyptian records show that pyramid construction productivity actually increased during summer months when the cooling network was fully operational. While other ancient construction projects shut down during extreme heat, Egyptian projects accelerated. The Nile cooling network extended beyond construction sites. Major cities along the river featured residential cooling systems that provided air conditioning for urban populations. Wealthy neighborhoods had direct connections to the cooling canals, while public cooling areas served the general population. Today, archaeologists and engineers working together have mapped extensive sections of this ancient cooling network. Some channels are still functional after 4,500 years, continuing to provide natural cooling to modern settlements built on ancient sites. The Nile air conditioning network represents perhaps the most ambitious environmental control project in ancient history, an entire civilization that refused to let climate determine their capabilities. But if you think Egyptian cooling mastery peaked with river-powered air conditioning, you're about to discover the most mind-bending ancient technology of all. The pyramids themselves were giant cooling machines. Yes, you read that correctly. The same monuments that have puzzled archaeologists for centuries weren't just tombs or religious temples. They were massive environmental control systems designed to create and distribute cool air across the entire Giza complex. Egyptian engineers had realized something that wouldn't be understood by modern science for millennia. Large stone structures can act as thermal regulators, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it at night in controlled ways that create powerful air circulation patterns. The pyramids weren't just built on random locations, they were positioned to take advantage of prevailing wind patterns, underground water sources, and thermal dynamics that could turn the entire Giza Plateau into a giant natural cooling system. Here's how it worked, and prepare to have everything you thought you knew about pyramid construction completely revolutionized. The internal chambers and passages weren't just burial spaces, they were air circulation systems. The complex network of passages, shafts, and chambers created controlled airflow that could move cooled air throughout the structure and out to surrounding areas. The pyramid's massive stone blocks acted as thermal mass, absorbing enormous amounts of heat energy during the day. But here's the genius part. The internal design created temperature differentials that drove powerful air currents. Hot air would rise through certain passages while cool air was drawn in through others, creating a natural ventilation system. The underground chambers weren't just for storing pharaohs, they were cooling chambers that used the Earth's natural temperature to create cold air that could be distributed through the pyramid's internal air circulation system. The Queen's Chamber and King's Chamber weren't just burial rooms, they were distribution hubs for a complex air conditioning network. The mysterious shafts leading from these chambers weren't for the pharaoh's soul to travel to the stars. They were air ducts that could move cooled air to different parts of the structure. But here's where Egyptian engineering gets truly impressive. The pyramids were designed to work together as a coordinated cooling system. The three main pyramids at Giza were positioned to create overlapping air circulation patterns. As temperature differentials developed around each pyramid, they created wind patterns that could distribute cooled air across the entire construction complex. The Sphinx wasn't just a guardian statue, it was part of the cooling system. Its position and orientation were calculated to interact with airflow patterns from the pyramids, creating additional air circulation that cooled the surrounding work areas. Modern computational fluid dynamics studies of the Giza complex have revealed air circulation patterns so sophisticated they rival modern HVAC design. The ancient Egyptians had accidentally, or deliberately, created a masterpiece of environmental engineering disguised as religious architecture. The pyramid cooling system was integrated with the broader Nile air conditioning network. Underground channels connected the pyramid cooling chambers to the river-powered cooling system, creating a unified climate control network that could maintain comfortable temperatures across the entire construction zone. During pyramid construction, workers weren't just building monuments, they were creating their own air conditioning. As each level of the pyramid was completed, it added to the cooling capacity of the overall system. The pyramids were self-improving cooling machines that got more effective as they got bigger. The technology extended beyond Giza. Other Egyptian pyramid sites show evidence of similar cooling systems adapted to local conditions. The pyramid complex at Dashur, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, all feature internal air circulation systems designed for environmental control. Egyptian architects had discovered that certain geometric shapes and internal designs could create powerful cooling effects using only natural forces. The pyramid shape itself was optimized for thermal regulation and air circulation. Modern engineers studying pyramid cooling systems have found design principles so advanced that some are being incorporated into contemporary green architecture. The idea of using building structure itself as an environmental control system remains cutting-edge technology. Today, standing inside the Great Pyramid on a hot summer day, you can still feel the cool air circulation that made pyramid construction possible. The same air currents that kept ancient workers alive continue to function after 4,500 years. The pyramids represent the ultimate achievement in ancient cooling technology, monuments that solved the problem of human survival in extreme heat while creating lasting symbols of civilization's triumph over impossible conditions. Tomorrow we'll discover how Mongol warriors stayed cool while conquering half the world on horseback, using portable cooling technology that would make modern military engineers weep with envy. So you thought Egyptians were impressive with their pyramid air conditioning? Well, meet the people who looked at conquering literally half the known world on horseback and said, you know what this needs? Portable climate control that we can carry while riding across deserts, mountains and tundra at the same time. Welcome to the Mongol Empire circa 1220 AD, where Genghis Khan's armies didn't just conquer from Korea to Eastern Europe, they did it while staying more comfortable than most modern campers, using cooling technology so portable it could be packed on horseback, and so effective it worked in every climate from the Gobi Desert to the Russian steppes. Picture this, you're a Mongol warrior, which is ancient Mongolian for person who has decided that conquering the world is a reasonable career goal. Your office is a saddle, your commute involves crossing continents, and your job requirements include staying battle-ready in temperatures ranging from 120-degree desert heat to -40 Siberian cold, often in the same week. Your equipment: a bow, a sword, and the most sophisticated portable environmental control system ever devised by nomadic engineering. Your training: learning to operate mobile cooling technology while galloping at full speed across terrain that would challenge modern vehicles. Your retirement plan: there isn't one because Mongols don't retire, they just conquer new places with better climates. Here's the thing about Mongol cooling technology: it had to work everywhere. Medieval peasants could build underground chambers and stay put. Romans could engineer massive infrastructure and defend it. Egyptians could tap into river systems and build permanent installations. Mongols, they had to carry their entire civilization on horseback and make it work in the Sahara, the Himalayas, the Russian tundra, and the Chinese rice paddies, often in the same campaign season. The result was the most advanced portable cooling technology in human history. Systems so ingenious that modern military engineers are still trying to figure out how Mongols kept ice frozen while crossing deserts on horseback. The foundation of Mongol cooling mastery was the yurt, but not the simple tent structures you see in museums. Mongol jurs were sophisticated environmental control systems disguised as portable housing. The felt walls weren't just insulation, they were engineered thermal regulation systems. Mongol felt makers had discovered that certain combinations of animal hair, treated with specific plant compounds, could create materials that actively cooled interior spaces through controlled evaporation and thermal exchange. The roof design wasn't just for shedding rain, it was an air circulation system that could create controlled airflow patterns. The central opening could be adjusted to regulate internal temperature, while the curved walls created air currents that distributed cooled air throughout the interior. But here's where Mongol engineering gets really impressive. Gyrs were designed for rapid assembly and disassembly, meaning Mongols could set up air-conditioned housing anywhere in the world in about 30 minutes. The really mind-blowing part? Different gyr configurations were optimized for different climates. Desert gyrs featured enhanced cooling systems, Arctic gyrs had improved heating, and temperate climate gyrs balanced both. Mongol armies could literally pack appropriate housing for any environment they might encounter. Modern materials scientists studying Mongol felt have discovered cooling properties so effective that some techniques are being incorporated into contemporary portable shelters. The principle of using natural materials to create active thermal regulation remains cutting-edge technology, but the GRs were just the beginning of Mongol portable cooling mastery, because when you're conquering the world on horseback, you need cooling technology that works while moving. Enter the most over-engineered cavalry cooling system in military history: horse-powered air conditioning. Mongol engineers had realized that horses are basically living cooling machines that generate controlled airflow while moving. The question was, how do you harness this cooling power for human comfort without interfering with military operations? The answer involved redesigning cavalry equipment as environmental control technology. Mongol saddles weren't just for riding, they were cooling systems that used horse movement and body heat to create controlled air circulation for the rider. Special saddle designs featured air channels that directed wind flow over cooling materials carried in saddlebags. As horses moved, they created forced air circulation that could drop rider temperature by 10 to 15 degrees, even in extreme heat. The riding equipment included cooling cloaks, garments that used horse-generated airflow to create personal air conditioning. These weren't just fabric, they were engineered cooling systems that turned cavalry charges into climate control operations. Standing on the Mongolian steppes today, watching traditional herders use techniques passed down from Genghis Khan's armies, you realize something profound. The people who conquered half the world weren't just tough, they were environmental engineering nomads who solved cooling problems while galloping across continents. Now, if you think Mongol cooling technology stopped at horse-powered air conditioning, you clearly don't understand the Mongol approach to logistics, which was basically, if we're going to conquer the world, we're going to do it in comfort. and that includes having ice cubes in the middle of the Gobi Desert. Meet the most over-engineered supply chain in military history. The Mongol Ice Cavalry, also known as the guys who kept Genghis Khan's drinks cold while he conquered China. Mongol generals looked at the problem of maintaining ice supplies during continental campaigns and came to a practical conclusion. We could learn to live without ice, or we could create a specialized cavalry unit whose only job is delivering frozen water to wherever the army happens to be. Let's go with option 2. The result was the world's first refrigerated military supply network, operated entirely on horseback and capable of delivering ice to Mongol commanders anywhere from the Arctic to the tropics. Here's how it worked, and prepare to have your mind blown by nomadic logistics mastery. Mongol ice operations began in the winter months, when armies would harvest massive quantities of ice from frozen rivers and lakes across their territory. This wasn't just gathering ice, it was industrial-scale frozen water production using traditional techniques that could preserve ice for months in any climate. The ice was cut into standardized blocks wrapped in specially treated felt and animal hides and stored in underground caches throughout Mongol territory. These ice storage depots were positioned along major campaign routes, creating a continent-spanning network of frozen supply points. But here's where Mongol engineering gets really impressive. They didn't just store ice, they created ice transport technology that could keep frozen water intact during desert crossings. Mongol ice cavalry rode specially selected horses trained for speed and endurance. The riders carried ice in insulated containers that used advanced materials science, combinations of felt, leather, and chemical cooling compounds that could preserve ice for days in extreme heat. The containers weren't just boxes. They were engineered cooling systems that used evaporation, thermal mass, and airflow control to maintain freezing temperatures while moving. Some designs could keep ice frozen for over a week in desert conditions. The really mind-blowing part? Ice cavalry operations were coordinated with military campaigns. Mongol generals would plan troop movements around ice delivery schedules, ensuring that commanders had access to cooling supplies during the most challenging parts of their campaigns. Advanced ice cavalry units carried ice-making equipment, portable devices that could create new ice using chemical cooling methods. These weren't just coolers, they were mobile ice factories that could produce frozen water anywhere using materials available in the field. The technology included ice preservation techniques that sound like medieval chemistry experiments. Mongol ice technicians had discovered that certain combinations of salt, plant extracts, and animal compounds could create supercooling effects that kept ice frozen well below normal melting temperatures. Modern preservation scientists studying Mongol ice storage methods have found techniques so effective that some are still used in specialized applications today. The principle of using natural materials to create controlled freezing conditions remains relevant technology. But ice cavalry wasn't just about luxury, it was about military effectiveness. Mongol commanders understood that troops performed better when they had access to cooling, and ice was the most effective cooling technology available. Ice was used for medical treatment of heat-related injuries, cooling of important supplies, and maintaining commander comfort during critical decision-making periods. A well-cooled general made better strategic decisions than an overheated one. The ice supply network extended beyond military operations. Mongol diplomatic missions carried ice as gifts to impress foreign rulers. Nothing demonstrated Mongol organizational capability quite like presenting a Chinese emperor with perfectly preserved ice blocks that had been transported across 1,000 miles of desert. Ice cavalry operations included specialized roles, ice scouts who identified the best sources of natural ice engineers who designed preservation systems, ice guards who protected valuable frozen supplies, and ice tacticians who coordinated delivery operations with military campaigns. The logistics were staggering. A major Mongol campaign could involve hundreds of ice cavalry riders, thousands of horses, and ice transport operations covering thousands of miles across multiple climate zones. Mongol ice operations represented perhaps the most ambitious portable cooling project in history. A military organization that refused to let geography or climate determine their comfort levels. Today, studying the roots of ancient Mongol ice cavalry, you can still find evidence of the storage caches, transport routes, and preservation techniques that kept the world's largest army supplied with frozen water while conquering half the known world. But if you think Mongol cooling mastery peaked with ice cavalry, you're about to discover the most impossible, ancient technology of all: portable ice-making machines that could create frozen water while riding across the desert, using nothing but nomadic chemistry and an absolute refusal to accept that deserts had to be hot. Mongol engineers looked at the problem of ice production during desert campaigns and had what can only be described as the medieval world's most audacious thought. What if we could just make ice wherever we happen to be, using materials we can carry on horseback? The answer involved chemistry so advanced that European scientists wouldn't figure it out for another 600 years. Meet the Mongol portable freeze units, devices so sophisticated they made Egyptian chemical cooling look like amateur hour. These weren't just ice makers, they were mobile winter factories that could create Arctic conditions in the middle of any climate. Here's how it worked, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about medieval technology. Mongol chemists had discovered that certain combinations of naturally occurring compounds could create endothermic reactions, chemical processes that absorbed so much heat energy they could freeze water even in desert temperatures. The basic mixture involved saltpeter, potassium nitrate, specific plant extracts, certain animal compounds, and mineral salts that Mongols collected from various regions of their empire. When combined in the right proportions, these materials could create cooling reactions powerful enough to turn water into ice in minutes. But here's where Mongol engineering gets really impressive. They made this technology portable. The freeze units were designed to be carried on horseback, operated while moving, and powered using materials that could be foraged or traded anywhere in the world. A typical Mongol freeze unit consisted of multiple components: reaction chambers where the chemical cooling took place, insulation systems that preserved the created ice, and cooling distribution networks that could provide chilled air for the operator. The advanced versions included cascade cooling, multi-stage systems that used the cooling from one chemical reaction to power additional cooling reactions, creating progressively lower temperatures. Some units could create ice so cold it remained frozen for days in extreme heat. The technology wasn't just functional, it was strategic. Mongol armies could create ice supplies anywhere, making them independent of natural ice sources and weather conditions. Desert campaigns that should have been impossible became routine because Mongols could manufacture their own winter. Modern chemists studying preserved Mongol freeze units have found cooling reactions so efficient they rival contemporary technology. The principle of using portable chemical reactions to create controlled cooling effects remains a key component of modern refrigeration. But here's the most Mongol part of the whole system. They didn't just make ice for themselves, they made it for psychological warfare. Imagine being a defending army in the middle of a desert siege, dying of heat and thirst, when Mongol negotiators arrive, carrying perfect ice cubes and offering to share them if you surrender peacefully. It was cooling technology as military intimidation. Mongol diplomatic protocols included ice demonstrations, formal presentations where Mongol engineers would create ice in front of foreign rulers as a demonstration of technological superiority. Nothing said resistance is futile, quite like making winter appear in the middle of summer. The freeze technology extended beyond ice production. Mongols could create cooling fields, areas around their camps where chemical cooling reactions created localized climate control. Entire armies could operate in artificially cooled environments while their enemies suffered in natural heat. Advanced Mongol cooling operations included freeze cavalry, specialized units whose only job was operating portable ice-making equipment during military campaigns. These weren't just soldiers, they were mobile cooling technicians who could create Arctic conditions anywhere in the world. The chemical knowledge required for freeze operations was closely guarded military intelligence. Mongol cooling formulas were treated as state secrets, passed down through specialized training programs, and protected by severe penalties for unauthorized disclosure. The technology included quality control. standardized procedures for testing cooling reactions, maintaining equipment, and ensuring consistent ice production across different environments. Mongol armies had better cooling quality assurance than most modern operations. Mongol freeze units could be customized for different applications: medical cooling for treating heat injuries, food preservation for extending supply durations, strategic cooling for maintaining commander comfort during critical operations. Today, archaeologists working in former Mongol territories still find evidence of portable freeze technology, reaction chambers, cooling compounds, and insulation materials that demonstrate the sophistication of nomadic ice-making operations. The Mongol portable freeze technology represents perhaps the ultimate achievement in ancient cooling mastery, the ability to create winter anywhere, anytime, using nothing but chemistry and nomadic engineering genius. But if you think Mongol cooling technology peaked with portable ice-making machines, you haven't met the ultimate expression of nomadic environmental control: Genghis Khan's personal climate system. Also known as the cooling technology so advanced, it made the Khan more comfortable than most modern people. When you're the ruler of the largest contiguous empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe, regular cooling solutions simply aren't sufficient. You need environmental control technology that can maintain perfect comfort while ruling from horseback across every climate zone on Earth. Meet the most over-engineered personal cooling system in history, the Great Khan's mobile climate control network. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer the world, he did it while enjoying personalized air conditioning that could maintain his preferred temperature regardless of whether he was crossing the Sahara or invading Russia in winter. The system began with the Khan's traveling court, not just a group of advisors and guards, but a mobile technological infrastructure designed to create optimal environmental conditions wherever the Khan happened to be. The centerpiece was the Khan's personal ger, but calling it a tent is like calling a modern aircraft carrier a boat. This was a sophisticated environmental control center disguised as nomadic housing. The structure featured multi-layer climate control, outer walls designed for thermal regulation, inner chambers with personal cooling systems, and air circulation networks that could maintain perfect temperature and humidity regardless of external conditions. But here's where Mongol engineering reaches its absolute peak. The Khan's ger was designed to interface with the broader cooling network. When the Khan arrived at any location, his personal climate system could connect with local cooling infrastructure, creating unified environmental control for the entire command area. The Khan's personal cooling included comfort cavalry, specialized riders whose only job was maintaining the Khan's environmental preferences. These weren't just servants, they were climate technicians who operated sophisticated cooling equipment while the empire moved across continents. The mobile cooling system featured climate scouts, advanced riders who would survey upcoming terrain and establish cooling operations before the Khan's arrival. By the time Genghis Khan reached any location, optimal environmental conditions were already prepared. Advanced cooling operations included thermal mapping, detailed analysis of climate conditions along campaign routes, with cooling strategies developed for each segment of the journey. The Khan's comfort was planned and engineered with the same precision as military operations. The personal cooling technology included portable comfort chambers, temporary structures that could be assembled anywhere to provide the Khan with controlled environmental conditions during meetings, planning sessions, and rest periods. But here's the most impressive part. The Khan's climate system was designed for rapid deployment and maximum mobility. The entire personal cooling infrastructure could be packed, moved, and reassembled without disrupting military operations. The technology extended to the Khan's horse, specially designed saddle systems that provided cooling while riding, allowing Genghis Khan to maintain comfort during long-distance travel across hostile terrain. Personal cooling included chemical climate control, portable devices that could adjust local temperature, humidity, and air quality based on the Khan's preferences. It was personalized air conditioning operated by nomadic chemistry. The Khan's cooling system influenced the entire Mongol military structure. Commanders throughout the empire had access to scaled-down versions of the Khan's climate technology, creating a hierarchy of environmental comfort that reflected military rank. Modern military engineers studying Mongol personal cooling systems have found technologies so advanced they're being incorporated into contemporary special operations equipment. The principle of creating personalized environmental control for mobile command operations remains cutting-edge military technology. The legacy of the Khan's climate system extended beyond military applications. Mongol rulers continued developing personal cooling technology for centuries, creating increasingly sophisticated environmental control systems for nomadic leadership. The psychological impact was enormous. Foreign rulers meeting with Mongol Khans were consistently impressed and intimidated by leaders who could maintain perfect comfort while commanding vast empires from horseback across impossible terrain. The Great Khan's climate system represented the ultimate achievement in portable cooling technology, personalized environmental control so advanced it allowed one person to remain perfectly comfortable while ruling half the world from a saddle. Today, standing on the Mongolian steppes, where Genghis Khan once commanded his empire, you can almost feel the lingering effects of technologies so advanced they seem magical. Portable cooling systems that conquered climate along with continents. And so ends our journey through the impossible cooling technologies of the ancient world, from medieval peasants turning animals into air conditioners, to Romans building desert refrigerators, to Egyptians making pyramids into cooling machines, to Mongols creating portable winter factories. Sweet dreams, and remember, the next time your air conditioning breaks down, at least you're not trying to keep ice frozen while conquering Asia on horseback.